This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
We're recording. Good afternoon. Hey, it's week 3 already. Hope you're all been having a good week, and you've been enjoying the readings and the tutorials. 3 pretty chunky readings this week, but I think they're pretty good in terms of kind of content. And it is a great pleasure to have one of the authors of one of the readings here today. Professor Terry Burke has kindly come along as our guest today to talk about housing systems and market performance. That's how you've your title, but
I'll explain what that means. Yeah.
I will not speak for Terry. Terry will explain what he means, and I'm really kind of humbled to be working with Terry, and Terry here. Terry is Professor of Housing Studies at Swinburne Centre for European Transitions. He's I'll just read a bit of his kind of bio to give you a sense of his background, but only gives
That's
a
urban transitions, not European transitions.
Did I say European?
You said European transition. I'm not going to be talking about Europe.
Okay.
I'm not from the centre of European transitions.
Okay.
Urban transitions.
I'm watching too much media about Brexit, I think, and it's kind of on my mind all the time. So within these broad areas, his interests are in housing, particularly housing affordability, lower income housing provision, public and private rental housing, the generational divide in housing, and comparative urban and social policies. Much of Terry's research is prompted by his concern that the urban and housing well-being of Australians is being eroded by unintended side effects of globalisation, economic change, and a political inability for policy reform. And I know the latter we kind of touched on quite a bit last week. Terry developed Swinburne's suite of courses in housing management and policy, and has undertaken a wide range of consultancy nationally and nationally competitive research studies for industry, government, and the third sector, so the not-for-profit area.
You can wind up with that.
Yeah,
that's too much detail. I don't need to know all that.
All I'm saying is, if you want good, one of your starting points for good references for writing good essays is Terry Burke. So it's great to have him here today to talk to us as well. So I'll hand you over to Terry for the start, and just to give you a kind of rundown of today, Terry will be with us, for the first part of the lecture, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and talk a bit about language and types of research, and it's very much focused on what you're looking at in your first assignment, so I'll be talking about that. But I'll leave that for now, and I'll put you up.
Thank you, Mark. I've got to discipline myself not to walk around the room as I talk, so I'm not used to doing that, so I'll just stand here and talk. So what I want to do today is talk about how a country's housing system works as affected by the market. Now, markets are obviously very important in the outcomes of any housing system, and it affects many things, and I'll comment on that in a moment. So we therefore have to have a very basic understanding of market theory, how markets work. But the important point about today's lecture is that housing is a commodity. Indeed, property is a commodity that actually doesn't necessarily work in accordance with market theories. It's such a problematic sector that markets can do different housing markets can, in a sense, be anomalous in terms of what it's meant to be doing. In other words, the outcomes of a market might not be ones which are predicted by market theory. And we have to understand that if we're going to work in the sector, analyse the sector, understand the sector, plan for the sector, make policy for the sector. So that's broadly what I want to do. There is going to be a very brief introduction to economic theory. I don't expect you to take that in depth. The reading does some of that, but it's really just to give you a feel for that market theory. And then I'm going to go into why housing, why property generally, in fact, cannot operate in accordance with the theory. I appreciate that many of you here are not from Australia. My references in some cases are going to be about Australia, but other countries will have equivalent problems or issues, perhaps not to the same scale, perhaps of a different type. So the obvious point, and Mike's probably already made this at the start of the course, housing markets are extremely important. Understanding them are extremely important for a number of effects, or for a number of reasons. Firstly, it affects the cost of housing and affordability. How the market operates and the drivers of demand and supply can affect housing affordability. And housing affordability therefore affects the opportunities of households in the way they live. So I was giving a professional development course this morning for another group, and we were talking about the history of housing policy in Australia, and I had contextual data going back to the 1960s. And somebody like me could buy a dwelling in 1968 with 10% of an average weekly earnings income. Now, 38% of average weekly earnings would be required to buy a dwelling. That's a huge difference from 10% to 28%. Something has gone wrong, or something different has occurred in how the market is structuring house prices with impacts on affordability. And for many of you, if you remain in Australia or if you already are going to be long-term residents of Australia, it's going to affect your opportunities to be homeowners. I've just finished a study for an organisation called Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute on the future of home ownership in Australia, and we've done modelling to 2040 to suggest that by the age of 60, only 50% of households will have achieved home ownership. Another 50% will be in the private rental sector to at least 60 years of age, which is a pretty shocking finding for a country that's had a history of 70 and 80% home ownership by the time that you've achieved that age cohort. So that's one. So we need to know what's happened in the market to create that situation. Can the market be changed to actually modify that? Markets also drive household and investor decision making. Markets create a price, and both households and investors will respond to those prices in different ways. They'll make decisions about what they purchase, what tenure they live in. So more and more households, by virtue of the prices of Australian housing, are forced or constrained or choosing to live in private rental. More and more households, by virtue of the price of housing, are choosing to live in multi-unit apartments because they're often the only ones that are now affordable, particularly in the inner and middle ring suburbs. And on the other hand, developers and builders, some of which may be represented among you as in terms of future employment, are also making decisions based on the price of housing, because that sends us signals about profitability and will structure what they build, where they build. It affects who participates in the market. So one thing the market has done in the last 20 years has basically, in the Australian context, brought a whole new set of actors into the market that weren't there in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And that is investors. Investors are now more important in the Australian housing market than first home buyers. They account for 35 to 40% of people purchasing property. In the 1960s, it was about 5%. A huge difference. And of course, what the market does in terms of price signals and responses to that can create employment opportunities or worsen employment opportunities depending upon the performance of the housing market. So a poorly performing housing market is going to create lesser employment than one that's performing well. Industries or firms will go out of business in a badly performing housing market, with implications for builders, developers, architects, etc. And finally, well, not quite finally, but getting there, the stability of the economy, to a very large extent, depends on the performance of a housing market. The global financial crisis of just over 10 years ago was basically caused because of failures in the housing market, initially in the United States, but then spreading to much of Europe and the rest of the world, with Australia one of the few countries that didn't actually experience the impacts of the global financial crisis. But in many respects, many countries around the world are still dealing with the hiccups left over from the global financial crisis because of a market failure in housing. That's how important housing is. So it's very important to understand it. Right. What is the basic housing market theory? It's a very simple one. What the market is essentially a relationship between the demand and supply of any good or service. And that relationship is captured in what we call price signals. If there is supply, if there's an increase in demand, that will send a signal to suppliers to adjust. If they can't adjust, the price will go up until there is an adequate adjustment. That there will be more houses, there'll be more apples, there'll be more cars, whatever it is. The price signals, because of that relationship between demand and supply, causes a response which creates a new market outcome. So as I've got here, if demand increases, the price signal sends information to suppliers who respond. Supply increases and you get an increase in the supply of whatever commodity we're talking about, in this case housing, and the economists talk about settling down to a new equilibrium. And the outcome is both consumers and suppliers are happy. The consumers get what they want because they sent the price signal. The price signal sends a signal about profitability. The suppliers respond to that profitability signal and provide the commodity. And in your textbooks that you would have looked at, and you probably glazed over these diagrams because they're not important, you don't really have to understand them. But these are the standard diagrams in any economic textbooks, basically for any commodity, to illustrate how markets work. So what we have here is a classic demand and supply diagram, which shows the quantity of any good, from zero quantity up to infinity here. Oops. And on the the vertical axis, you've got the price. So, supply will respond to price. At zero price, there'll be no supply. You'll have enormous demand because everybody will want something for zero price. So demand is right up there and supply is down here. The converse applies as well. At a very high price, consumers will drop out of the market, but suppliers will want to supply. But the idea is there will be adjustments there. There is an equilibrium where price matches what suppliers want to supply. So say there's an increase in demand. That's what the second diagram shows. An increase in demand of a commodity from D1 to D2. This could be because perhaps finance changed and more people want to purchase a house. So the amount of demand at any price level goes up. Initially, as you see up here, the price will rise to this P2. So the price of houses rises. That sends a signal to developers and builders, or whoever is a supplier for whatever commodity economists are looking at, to respond. So, within a time period, there's an increase in the supply, and you can see what happens. A new equilibrium is met where the price is back to what it was and everybody's happy again. That is the theory. The problem with housing markets is they don't perform exactly to that theory. And there's a number of reasons for that. But before I get onto those, what determines these conditions of supply? What determines these conditions of demand for housing? What would make what we call the demand curve shift upwards, or the supply curve to shift upwards, or constrain their ability to do so? So when we look at housing, the major sources of demand are people's incomes. You can't purchase a house without income. So the level and rates of increase in incomes are very important. The levels of wealth of a society, of the people in society, can also affect housing demand, because there's evidence that as people have more wealth, they have more confidence in purchasing a property, and they will trade up their property. And they borrow against that wealth. So the wealthier a society, the greater the housing demand. And that'd be one reason why there's very high demand for housing in Australia. There's others, I'll come to that. But it's interesting that in terms of actual international measures of wealth, as distinct from incomes, Australia is the wealthiest or richest country in the world per capita. The average Australian is worth more than anybody else from any other country. And Australians over the last 20 or 30 years have actually been leveraging more and more borrowing against that wealth. We feel that we've got the confidence to purchase, and it's been driving demand. Of course, people's values and preferences, which will differ from society to society, will also drive the nature of housing demand. Not only the aggregate amount of demand, but the specific elements of demand for, in a sense, sub-markets within a market. So, for example, we've got a demand for housing generally, but people will make choices based on values and preferences for the type of housing, the tenure of housing, the location of housing. So Australians historically have had a very strong value preference for detached housing. Hence the form of Australian cities, very low density because of the dominance of detached housing. Even despite the enormous growth in multi-unit housing in the last 2.5 decades, we've still got something like 65% of all dwellings in Australia are detached housing, which is the highest percentage of any country in the world. Many other countries have virtually no detached housing. Is anybody here from Hong Kong? No, they're out protesting. If you have been to Hong Kong, it's virtually a city of just high-rise apartments. There are some low-rise apartments for the very rich, but the entire city is virtually high-rise apartments. That's partly a value preference, it's what they used to, but it also represents the constraints of the land. Of course, one of the other big factors in housing demand is household growth. How many households there are and what is the rate of growth of a household in a country. And in that context, that's one of the pressures on the Australian housing system and in many of the Asian housing systems as well, but not excluding, but that excludes Japan. Amongst Western countries, Western developed countries, Australia by far has the fastest population and household growth, almost double the average of all the other countries. Some major developed countries like Germany and Japan have zero or negative household growth. Now, if you've got zero or negative household growth, your driver of demand is going to be very different. So, say a developer and builder in those countries has to be very careful about what they build. Because if you've got no household growth, you've got to provide the right product to sell to the existing population. You cannot rely just on population growth and associated household growth to take up your product. And of course, the cost and availability of finance is very important. How much finance is available in an economy and what the price of that finance is. And this is a problem across the world at the moment in some respects for housing systems. Finance, you could argue, is just too cheap. The interest rates in virtually all countries in the more or less developed world are the lowest they've been in 200 years. Now, if you're an investor, a developer, a builder, this is a huge opportunity. If you're a purchaser, it's a huge opportunity. But as everybody is borrowing at cheap interest, what it can mean is that there's too much demand relative to supply. And that's one of the big drivers of the escalation in property prices right around the world. Finance is just too cheap compared to what it was before right up to the global financial crisis. To 2008, historically, we've been talking about average interest rates in Australia around about 6%, and peaking in 1988 at 18%, which just seems like an amazing idea that these days that we could have mortgage interest rates at 18%, but that's what they were. Now they're down at 3%. And I read in the paper, one of the papers today, the International Guardian, that in Denmark, interest rates are now minus. The banks are actually paying you to borrow. Of course, what that means, they're not going to make a loss on that. That means that for lenders to that bank, you're paying them to store your money. And that's where around the world lots of interest rates are heading, close to zero or negative interest rates, which we've never been in that position historically. We do not know what the implication will be for housing markets around the world when we get to that sort of state. And then every country will have a set of policy incentives which will drive the demand in certain ways. Australia has an unfortunate, I believe, set of policies which are sending the wrong signals. It's encouraging more investment by investors and deterring home ownership. We'll get onto that. On the supply side, very quickly, what determines supply? Well, it's the cost and availability of land, construction costs, labour and materials, the cost and availability of finance again, perceived market opportunities. Builders, developers and investors read the market, and they're not going to increase supply if they feel that they cannot sell that property. And we've learnt a lot of lessons from the global financial crisis. One of the reasons why the global financial crisis occurred, and particularly in other countries, not in Australia, was that banks overlent to builders and developers on a speculative model of building constructed houses when there was no evidence that there was demand for those houses. They just had a confidence that supply would create its own demand. So across the United States, Spain, Ireland, Turkey, Greece, Netherlands, speculative builders, financed by the banks, built houses in excess of their actual demand for housing. When the global financial crisis occurred, or partly cause of the global financial crisis, was that builders and developers started to fall over and couldn't pay the bank loans because they couldn't sell these properties. Then consumers that had bought some of those properties found themselves in positions of unemployment, and they too started falling over. And it spiralled down. So many banks went bankrupt in the United States and Europe, and basically caused the global financial crisis. And even today, a country like Spain and Turkey, Netherlands, not so much Netherlands, but Ireland, still has 5% or 10% of their housing in urban areas just sitting there vacant. Built 10, 12 years ago and still unable to be sold, with the builders, developers having built those all gone broke. So, you've got to be able to read the market opportunities. It's much easier in Australia, for one reason relating to that demand. We're actually generating that demand for supply by having a rate of household growth, population growth, that no other Western country has. And again, there's a policy on incentives. Every country will have a set of policies which will affect demand and supply. Now, I'll just skip over something here very quickly. This is a diagrammatic representation I use to understand the institutional framework in which housing markets operate. There's not one about Australia, it's a generic one that will apply to every country in the world. And what you just have to do, if you're using a diagram like that, is just plug in the knowledge about your particular country to identify how the housing market would work, what are the parameters driving demand and the parameters driving supply. So right at the top, you've got the very big institutional attributes of your system of governments, your demographic structure, your economic system, your societal norms and values, and your geography environment. Every country's got those attributes. And differences in those attributes will drive what is built. So just take geography environment. By and large, Australians build crappy houses. But we don't need to build very strong, well-built houses, because we've got, with some exceptions, a fairly benign climate. We do not have to build walls 300 centimetres thick like in the north of the United States, Canada and Europe, because we don't have that climate. We don't have hurricanes, typhoons, the same as you might have in parts of Asia, well, except in Queensland we do, and we do have to build to higher standards, but in Melbourne, Sydney, the rest of Australia, we don't have to worry about that. So your geography and environment, if you work through, will affect what you demand and what you supply. Below that level, there's a whole other set of, a subset of institutional frameworks, is the nature of your urban form, the nature of your labour market, the nature of your financial system, the distribution of income and wealth in society, and then you've got public policy. These in turn will drive household values and behaviours, investors' values and behaviours, and developers' values and behaviours, and ultimately how the housing market works from country to country. And there are very different outcomes of housing market from country to country, partly because of the different institutional attributes of that of a country. And one could argue Australia at the moment has probably got more serious housing problems than a number of equivalent countries, because we have a different institutional framework, a different institutional structure. Now, going back, what shapes demand and supply? Just to illustrate this point quickly about context of the market, what drives supply and demand. It can be those institutional attributes are very important. And just this is two that are interesting, and one I've already referred to. This here is population growth by a number of the major Western countries. You can see this is Australia here, the highest rate of growth of any of these countries, with Japan 0, Germany near 0, Netherlands a third of the rate of Australia. Most of the countries are a third of the rate of Australia. So that is a very important driver of housing demand and how we understand how the Australian housing system will operate. On the other hand, this diagram represents a very different sort of information. You say, well, that's not relevant for housing, but it is. This is unemployment benefits as a percentage of average weekly earnings for different countries. Some of you might have read about the debates around New Start in Australia, which is Australian unemployment benefits. New Start it's called. This is all the countries in the OECD, the most affluent countries in the world. It includes most of Europe, doesn't include some of Eastern Europe, the United States, Canada, and a number of Asian countries, including Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia. And you can see that Australia has, as a percentage of average weekly earnings, the meanest, leanest unemployment benefits of any OECD country. Now that means there's a sizable minority of the population which by definition cannot have the income to certainly participate in the home ownership market, but will also struggle in the private rental market. In a way which countries up here, you take Denmark, just here, their unemployment benefits are 80% of average weekly earnings. So if you become unemployed in Denmark, you can still afford to buy a house. And it's no coincidence that in the last 20 years, these countries now are experiencing home ownership growth to levels that we never achieved, that Australia never achieved, while Australia is going backwards. Australia peaked at 72% home ownership. We're now down to 67, and we're heading towards 50%. Countries like Norway, Denmark, etc., much of Eastern Europe are getting up to 85% home ownership because they've got very different institutional contexts. Well, I was going to talk about the problems of the Australian housing system. I won't do that necessarily because I want to keep it fairly general so you can apply this analysis to any country you're thinking of. So I'll get on to why housing markets don't necessarily perform consistent with the theory of economics, the demand and supply theory. And the reason that it doesn't is really twofold. The theory gives too much weight to markets operating in accordance to the theory and the assumptions which underpin the theory. And therefore the economic analysis doesn't give due weight or provide sufficient understanding of the socio-economic realities, such as the institutional environment which housing markets operate in. And that gets to the 2 point. A lot of economic texts have a limited understanding of the institutional context in which markets operate. They just assume it away because it makes their analysis easier. But it doesn't help if you're trying to understand a complex commodity like housing and what's going to happen with housing. What is the future of housing industry? So, some of the reading this week would have probably introduced you to these basic assumptions of how market works. They require these assumptions to underpin that model that I put up on the board, where there's sort of almost instantaneous adjustment to price signals. Where prices go up following an increase in demand, suppliers will respond, and then you'll get a new market equilibrium. That is dependent on these assumptions. The first one is that all participants in the market are rational economic consumers or actors. They behave in accordance with one principle, that they're driven by self-interest as measured by income or profit gain. That is what is called a rational person, somebody whose consumption is driven essentially by self-interest. And self-interest is measured by either income gain or profit gain. The second one is the existence of private property and the availability of money. That's fairly obvious. You can't sell if you don't have private property and there's not money available. But the only actors in society are producers and consumers. That diagram shows a demand curve for consumers and a supply curve for producers. But there's a whole other actors, and we'll get onto that. That there are large numbers of buyers and sellers in the market. Why that is required, if there's only one seller in the market, one provider, then it doesn't matter what price signals the consumer will send. That producer will just say, take it or like, take this commodity or bugger off. That you have to take our conditions. And that's one of the concerns that are beginning to occur with companies like Amazon and Google. They're getting so large that they're beginning to dictate consumer behaviour. There isn't the competition in that market that they should act in the way of economic theory. And the other one is consumers and producers have perfect knowledge, that they know what the attributes of a product are, and therefore can make decisions on the attributes of the product. And producers know exactly what the consumer is wanting and therefore can provide that product. Knowledge is required on both parts. And finally, you can't have the rapid adjustment illustrated in that diagram earlier on unless there's rapid mobility of resources. In other words, a builder, a supplier of some sort, for any commodity, can bring together the land, labour, capital required to bring a product on the market. So they're the basic assumptions that economic theory operates on. But in reality, it doesn't work. And here's a diagram from a recent study that I've just finished, or two diagrams from a recent study I've just finished, which shows the rates of construction in Australia over the last 46 years compared to population growth. Now, economic theory, as I spelt out before, should suggest that the greater the population growth, the greater the housing supply. That supply should respond to the population growth because that sends signals of demand to cause a market response. But except for a peak here back in 1991-93, the trend is, the desirable figure is 1, this one here, where you have a 1-to-1 ratio between population growth and household and dwelling growth. And we've only achieved that a few times in the last 40 years. For whatever reasons, Australia is not able to construct the housing at the rate of population demand. And of course, what would you expect as an outcome if you can't match supply to demand? Price increases. So it's no surprise that Australia has some of the largest price increases in dwelling in dwellings over the last 30 years. And Australia is now one of the most expensive countries to buy property in. We can't keep pace with demand. Now this is another version of, or another sort of test of market theory. If prices rise, according to market theory, as I've explained it to you, then construction should increase. Respond to that prices. Here again, in grey, the black is dwelling completions in Australia, if you can see that. I need a big ruler or I need to be taller, one or the other. But this line here. Now, if you look from 1986 to 2012, despite the big increases in house prices in those years, there was no construction response. The rate just more or less remained stable. The only time there has been a response to price signals is from 2014-15 on, the last 3 years. A lot of that being the multi-units that are being built around Melbourne and Sydney. And what you can clearly say there is the market is not responding to the price signals. The market is not operating in accordance to theory. Something is going wrong. Why isn't the housing market operating in accordance with theory? And these are some of the answers. And of course these will vary from country to country because of their institutional environments. But the first one, the large number of buyers and sellers. The fact is there may not be large numbers of buyers and sellers in the housing market to make it competitive. Now you think, that's a bit odd because there's lots of buyers and sellers out there. There's lots of producers, there's lots of consumers. But when you look at housing markets, you have to not only think in terms of aggregates, but also of sub-markets. So in sub-markets, say regional areas, there may be very few builders, developers operating, and they're not responsive to the price signals in those areas. Alternatively, and this is a very problematic one for Australia, people on low incomes do not have the ability to send signals about prices for expensive properties. So what does the property market do? It just ignores them. There's a major undersupply of affordable, low-cost housing in Australia. And Mike will talk about this in subsequent weeks. Probably amongst Western countries, we have the biggest shortage of affordable, low-cost housing for low to moderate income earners because there's no suppliers in that market. They don't see that there's adequate profit, there's no supply. So there's no competition operating in that market. The market is not operating in accordance with the assumption. Of course, the perfect knowledge is something that consumers and producers have perfect knowledge. That breaks down fundamentally in housing because housing is such a complex product. When you've gone to rent, in some cases own, I don't know what you're doing, some of you are probably still living with parents, but when you do go to rent or do go to buy, what are you actually renting? What are you actually buying? Is it the location? Is it the type of dwelling? Is it the quality of the dwelling? Is it the amenity around the immediate dwelling? Is it the neighbourhood? Is it the condition of the property? What is it that you're actually purchasing? So how does a producer know exactly what to supply when the price signal is a very blunt one where we actually don't know what signal people are consuming, are sending rather? And vice versa, producers have much greater knowledge about how markets work and in some cases can control the markets. So estate agents on a producer side or a supplier side have enormous power compared to you as somebody going to look for a rental property. That problem is called asymmetric information. That certain players in the market have much greater information about the market than you or the consumers, and they can manipulate, they can distort, they can control market behaviour by virtue of that asymmetric information. They'll give a property to somebody else rather than you, and you'll never know why. It can lead to enormous inequities, bias, discrimination in the housing market. Resources are severely constrained. This is the resource mobility problem. But in housing, if prices go up today, as they're starting to again, how long would it take a developer to respond? Well, it may take 2 years to respond because of the immobility of resources. It's hard to acquire land, to get planning permits, to get the labour supply, to get the finance, because if you're doing a multi-unit property, you've got to pre-sell 70% before the banks will finance you. And then you've got to do all the marketing and advertising to pre-sell those properties. That can take 2 years, some take 3 years before you can actually build construction. Or start construction. The problem there is, you acted to a price signal 3 years ago and you're bringing it onto the market now where the context might be different. This is potentially a problem that Melbourne's got in the next year or 18 months. Enormous number of multi-unit properties coming onto the market, going back to that diagram, stimulated by the price increases of the last boom, 18 months ago or 2 years ago. But will they have the demand for all the properties that are being on the market? Well, fortunately they will have, most of them will have that demand being driven by, as I said before, the population growth. They can get by on that. But, as you might have read today, the government is considering cutting back on migration because of the pressures on our housing system and our infrastructure. Now, if they cut back on that, builders and developers are not necessarily going to have the demand for the properties that they anticipated. Some will go broke. I have no doubt in the next 2 to 3 years that quite a few developers, particularly in Melbourne, will go broke. Now, the other theory is that there's only consumers and producers in the market. Consumers are essentially individuals acting, or at least a household acting in accordance with their housing needs. And on the other side is the producers, basically builders and developers. But in fact, a housing market has multiple players operating in it. Finance institutions, governments, and governments of state governments, local governments, and central governments. That institutional environment will differ from country to country, but they greatly complicate the housing story and will affect the ability of developers and builders to get properties on the ground. You'll have community groups that are opposed to multi-unit development and will use the legal processes to stop that. Again, adding to the time it takes to get a property onto the market. You've got governments introducing planning controls, building regulations. It's going to take time. All of these are just assumed to not exist in market theory. And then finally, you've got non-rational behaviour. People don't operate rationally in terms of the narrow definition of rational behaviour of the economic model. We have emotions, sentiments, obligations. So just because housing is cheaper in a country town or in the outer suburbs, for example, lots of people just can't go and buy it because they might have family obligations, they might have educational obligations for their children, they might have various social networks that they have obligations to, community obligations. They drive your housing decision making as much as the narrow economic interest of increasing your income well-being or your financial well-being. Now, economists ignored those, but one of the readings you looked at this week on behavioural economics is economists beginning to understand that behaviours are driven by a whole range of other sentiments other than just mere profit or income gain. And how does that shape human behaviour, demand and therefore supply? Now that's one side of the equation about the problems of markets. The other problem, these are what we call market imperfections. They're imperfections about how the market operates. In addition to those, you've got another concept which is that of market failure. This is not about markets being imperfect. This is about markets just not being able to meet these needs. But they add complexity to why housing markets don't necessarily operate in accordance with market theory. Probably in other subjects in this course you've been introduced to these concepts, or not necessarily in this course, into this whole program that you're looking at. But a very important one is third-party or externality effects. This is the recognition that in any market transaction between a producer and consumer, there will be effects on third parties other than the producer and consumer. So if you build a huge, high, ugly, monstrous house, you're going to have side effects on your neighbours. You might have overshadowing. You might have loss of privacy. And you might have visual pollution, which actually devalues the value of properties around you. So how do you deal with that historically? Governments have introduced planning legislation and building controls to minimise the externality or third-party effects. Now that was just a minor example, but historically all countries have to deal with the third-party effects of overcrowding, the creation of slums, quality issues, noise, the lack of sustainability built into properties, and traffic, things like traffic congestion. They're all side effects of market transactions. And of course, the big one that's debated around the world at the moment is climate change. That's a major third-party effect. It's an unintended side effect of market transactions, whether it's us buying a car and using a car, or whether it's us buying a house and filling it up with white goods, expensive lighting, which has to be powered by a coal-powered power station. That process creates third-party effects. And there's nothing that the markets can do about that. That's where governments have to step in and say, we have to regulate. We've got to do something to prevent these third-party effects occurring. We've got to look after the wider public good. A second failure of markets is their inability to supply what we call merit goods. These are goods that any society deems sufficiently meritorious that it has to be supplied in large quantities or of sufficient quality. Mass education. The private market would not provide mass education. They provide it to only those that can afford it, which is essentially what we've got in Australia with our private education system. Australia is one of the few countries that has a private education system of the scale that it's got. But underpinning that, in recognition that the bulk of people cannot attend private fee-based schools, you have to have a free public school system. Every country does that. They do it to different degrees. Some countries, particularly like the Scandinavian countries, do not allow any private education. Everybody has to go to a public school. And then then you've got others, like Australia, at the extreme, where you do have some private market, but the government stepping in to provide the rest because it seemed to be meritorious. Healthcare is the same. There's a whole... What is deemed to be a meritorious good differs from country to country. So in some countries, childcare is seen to be a meritorious good and governments will step in and provide it. We don't. Public housing or social housing is seen to be a merit good, but it differs very greatly from country to country about what the expectations are on government to provide that merit good. And as Mike will point out in some weeks' time, Australia's probably at the extreme end of not valuing social housing as a merit good. We have close to the lowest percentage of social housing in the Western world. We're down at 4%. The average is 20%. Some other affluent countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, etc., go up to 30, 35%. Finally, and I'll give you a break after this point, the problem with markets is that they can't deal with income distribution and wealth distribution. It will create an income distribution, but it will be one that most society will decide is inappropriate. If you think about it, private providers of a good and service are only going to provide an income to the workers that provide that good and service. They're not going to pay an income to an unemployed person, to an aged person. They're only going to provide an income for the economically employed. So who looks after those that can't be employed? The aged, the unemployed, the disabled, the unwell, the ill, etc. Where do they get their income from in a free market system? They don't. They starve to death. So governments intervene in the market and provide things like income support to assist people to continue living. With countries differing very greatly in the scale and form of that income support, and as I illustrated before, despite the sort of belief that you might get from Australian governments that we're very generous in terms of income support, we're not. We're one of the leanest and meanest countries in the world. Very low pensions, very low unemployment benefits. But they are at a level which does stop people basically starving to death. But they're nowhere near the scale of many other countries. We make different choices about the scale of intervention into merit goods, and we don't make different choices about the scale of interventions with respect to the wealth and income distribution of a society. The other way in which you deal with the income and wealth distribution is through the tax system. Two ways: income support and the tax system. So you tax higher income people to redistribute it to lower income people in some way. Now, Australia is relatively good at that in terms of the progressiveness of our tax system. So we're not as bad, in actual outcomes, we're not as bad as one might expect from the income support system. Right, well, let's just have a break now, but that's what it's got us through is to an understanding that housing markets do not necessarily perform in accordance with market theory, and housing markets are potentially problematic. They're potentially unstable. They can fall over and create major inefficiencies. They create major housing issues such as affordability, housing quality, one of the emergent issues in Australia. Right, what sort of break do you have, Mike?
I reckon we'll just go for 5 today. 5 minutes. All right, we're back at... Give you a chance to check your phone. So back at about 6:25.
I'll probably have only another 10 to 15 minutes after.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is it sort of that sort of what you Yes.
that it's not to the extent of your kind of graph, but I'll be going on that kind of course. So I'm working on that
Yeah, so this is my modification of that. You can see that. Yes, I've now modified this to say this.
Okay, so this is the update. Yeah, because I've been kind of working on.
That's right.
This is at least a way to start.
Well, that's
kind of
good
breaking
because
through,
you can actually use this again if you want to and say, well, look what we've been talking about. I've been talking very generally, but you've been concentrating on specific elements of your sub-markets within housing because I haven't really been talked about. Some of the subsystems in housing. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Well, because I not 2 years ago, that was actually really useful. I found it really useful.
Yeah.
Some ways to kind of work with students.
Yeah.
Think that, there's been very good questions about that.
The advantage of you going into those subsystems, which I've concentrated on homes, is you can draw out some of the details, which I briefly referred to the fact that we don't have a speculative housing system like many other countries, so we didn't get caught in the financial way. That is sort of distinctive element of the production subsystem of Australia. Yes, and that's right. And that partly derives from the non-existence of the speculative system, because in a spec system you have to be both the landowner and the builder, because you buy the land and put all the 500 dwellings on and then sell it. Well, that's probably they hope they sell it, but they didn't in many cases. But in our system, and then either an individual builder or an individual household like us will go out and buy an individual allotment on that. Some of the builders will buy 4 or 5 or more, but very few will have a lot less.
But I find it very interesting. Things we're trying to do, in theory, they're coming.
Yeah.
Is that very straightforward?
No.
It's not because of what happens with the land. In fact, the developers know all the support.
Why does the developer get all the uplift in value? And what do you do about people that actually don't end up constructing at all? All they're doing is turning on the planning, selling the planning permit.
So,
Which is part of the regulatory system. Other countries do have regulatory control. Very light country in terms of regulation. This is part of being society. And that's where we're being forward. There's just so many instances now of privatisation and weak regulation.
well, I talked a lot last week.
decision that consumers should just legally adapt their circumstances to the loan, and they should. And the judge said they should give them their prime stakes and their rent. Yeah, no understanding of that model based on case people from poverty. So that's a good one to add to the story.
I will. All right, we'll get back into it. Kerry's got to finish off his part, and then I'll kind of come in and do.
Well, very briefly, I'll take you back to this diagram and illustrate how it relates to what Mike has been talking about and will continue to talk about. So you've got this very big institutional environment which every country will have, but will differ in the attributes of that institutional environment. That in turn drives the structure, conduct and performance of the housing market, and what Mike's been doing in this course and what will be done over the rest of the course is provide a greater understanding of, in a sense, how the particular elements of the Australian housing system plays out, including what it means for the performance of that system. But again, this diagrammatic representation here is not one that's specific to Australia. It can be about any country in the world. So if you're looking at the production subsystem here, how a country produces its housing, I just want to reaffirm what I was saying before, that part of the problem with the global financial system was many countries have what we call that speculative system of construction, where a property developer will buy up a land and will construct X number of houses on that property. Maybe 50, maybe 100, maybe 400 or 500 houses they'll put on that block of land and just hope that there's a market for it. Well, that all fell over in the global financial crisis, as I mentioned before. But Australia, over the last 50 years, has evolved a different system of construction, which is a contract building model, where a developer will subdivide the land and either individual builders or more often individual households will buy the block of land on that development. Alternatively, if it's apartment, they'll pre-sell and they'll buy within that apartment, and until they get 70% sold, the developer can't get the finance. So you've got to effectively have a contractual obligation for each property to get the finance. For individual properties, for individual households, and this is something I do when I have international visitors, I take them to a display village because it's very unique by world standards. What a household does in Australia is to buy a block of land and then they'll go to a display village and they'll choose the French Provincial Mark IV or the Californian Mark V and sign a contract with the builder to put it on that block of land. In both the multi-unit industry and the detached housing industry, that means that virtually every property has a contractual sale attached to it. The properties are not sitting there waiting for purchases. They're constructed after a person has signed a contract. So on that principle, you can't get the massive collapse that you've had in other countries because the bulk of properties have already been purchased. There's a buyer for each property. The weakness in that is 30% in the apartment market and the pre-sales in the apartment market. If it looks like the market gets too shaky, people can walk away from a pre-sales. That leaves the developer in a market risk situation. Some of that will occur, I think, in Melbourne. It's already occurring in Sydney, partly because of concerns about the quality of construction of newly built apartments. Some people say, no, it's too high a risk, we're going to walk away from it before we lose more money. We'd rather lose our $10,000 deposit than have to come up with 50 or 100,000 to restore the property to a habitable standard. So that's the relationship between this broad institutional framework and the specific housing market framework that you'll be looking at in this course. Right. What are the implications for the planning and design professions in this? Well, they're quite significant. The industry power, the power of a particular industry, can shape the policy making process. And in Australia, as in most countries, lobbying is a very important input into the policy making process. Governments are swayed by lobbyists. And in Australia, probably more so than most countries, or more Western countries, I think the same situation might apply in many Asian countries, developers, through their industry associations, have major lobbying power and can influence policy directions and therefore how the housing market operates. So the best example of that is the recent elections, where Labor went to an election with a platform of not getting rid of negative gearing, which is an incredibly dumb policy, by the way, but to restructure negative gearing to get good housing outcomes from it. But a huge industry has grown up around the negative gearing tax provisions, and they lobbied the government and the community in a way which I think was part of the failure of the Labor government to get elected. So we're now left with negative gearing in its raw format, which is very problematic. I can't think of one housing expert that's not attached to any lobby group, the independent ones, that don't say that negative gearing is problematic. It is displacing first home buyers and it is driving up house prices. But we're now stuck with it because of a very effective lobby. So you're going to be working in an industry with considerable power. That's an example at the Commonwealth level, but Mike works in local government and has to deal with that industry all the time and their power and influence, particularly with respect to local governments. Now, some of that power can be used for the good. Government's decision-making is not always necessarily right. They do have to have the informed decision-making, informed knowledge of people that are the key actors out there. The governments will get it wrong. But you have to be very cautious in how, or planners in local government, people in, say, Treasury and housing planning, have to be very cautious about what evidence is being put forward by the development, building, investment lobby. Because there is this issue of policy capture. As I've hinted at, and Australia's been very lucky in this context, that the housing industry, the property industry, is a very unstable industry. Australia's been very lucky in the sense that it's had a certain stability for a very long period of time. Even the recent downturn in prices, which got enormous exposure in the media, was a very modest downturn compared to that of other countries over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's going to recover quite quickly, I think. We haven't had falls of 30 and 40% in prices. Australia fell overall by about 4%. Sydney fell by 9%, but they were very high. But overall, it's only been about 4%, which hasn't been enough to achieve any improvement in affordability whatsoever. The problem with industry instability is it creates employment instability. So reading the market becomes very important. If you're into the development side of the industry, the building side of the industry, you've got to be very good at reading the market and understanding where the market's going. And there are very clever developers out there that are good at that. I think one of the new directions, and Mike will talk about this later on, is the recognition that Australia has become extremely expensive and there's a clear lack of affordable housing. And so there are beginning developers saying, there's a new market opportunity in there. What sort of products can we create to capture the affordable housing market? Those developers, I think, are going to have enormous success over the next 10 years. Others that pitch at the higher end of the market, I think some of them are going to struggle because the high end of the market is not where the bulk of the people are. Some are, but the bulk aren't. The third point there is that the very high costs of the Australian housing industry, basically, that high cost, and Mike might talk about this later on, the high cost in Australia derives from the very expensive land component. Australia's land is very expensive. Certain irony in that is that we appear to have more than most countries, yet our land is more expensive. But what that means is it's very difficult for builders and developers to provide those affordable products. So it's got to be a very clever model that people come up with. But what it does, it has limited the provision of housing form in a way which is going to be long-term problematic. In the last 20 years, we've probably built too much 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings in the inner and middle suburbs of Melbourne, which raises the question, where do families live? Where are families going to be able to purchase to access the key amenities of the inner and middle ring suburbs if all the sector is building is 1 and 2 bedroom properties, driven by the high cost of land? So there's going to be, I think, pressure coming from local governments through perhaps affordable housing agreements or other negotiation tools they have to say, look, we don't want any more 1 bedroom dwellings. We've got to start building a diversity of new building forms, because families are still important. And we can't have all of them on the urban fringe spending 2 hours a day driving to the strong labour markets of the inner city. That gets us to the next point, that the industry structure that we have may produce products that are not best for our urban form. It's quite clear that we're starting to produce, or have produced, products of an inferior quality, which are not good for the community, which raises, and the problem for that is that people are losing trust or losing confidence in the development industry, particularly the multi-unit industry, which gives weight, therefore, to community opposition groups opposing multi-unit development. So it's going to be a very challenging environment for developers and builders and the planning agencies that they have to work through in the next decade to get more housing on the ground. That's in the Australian context. It could be different in other countries. Right. This relates to the broader institutional environment, but that is, Australia is what we call a market liberal society, which is very light on regulation compared to many other societies. I've just had 10 days in Singapore, which is a heavily regulated society, but you can actually see the difference in the development of the urban form and the quality of housing in a way that you can't see that in Australia. The problem there is that we haven't got the mechanisms to solve some of the major problems that we've got confronting us. So we do not have inclusionary zoning in Australia. Have you been introduced to the concept of inclusionary zoning in other subjects? No. Very briefly, inclusionary zoning is a planning rule or principle where governments mandate as a condition of a planning permit for multi-unit developments of a certain size, perhaps over 30 or 40 units upwards, a percentage has to be affordable or social housing. And therefore a developer, in recognition that they've got to provide that percentage, will build that into their business model. And when they go out and purchase land, they will say, we can't offer what we used to be able to offer that land because we've got to put X amount of cheaper housing on. Where we might offer you 3 million or 5 million, we're now only offering 1.5. So that the landowner bears the cost. But the benefit is, well, that has the unanticipated side effects benefit of reducing property costs, land costs generally, but also means you get a percentage of affordable housing, effectively for nothing, because the builder has provided it into his construction costs. And that can then be handed over or sold to, if affordable home ownership, at below market prices to get people into home ownership. It can be given to community housing associations to manage as social housing. We don't have that in Melbourne, in Victoria. But I think it's 20% in the United Kingdom, it's 10% in much of the in the large cities of the United States. And what that's doing is forcing builders and developers to create new products as a condition in order to be able to meet inclusionary zoning. I actually think it will come in Victoria. We're heading towards it with the affordable housing legislation that was introduced last year, but we haven't got there yet. And one of the other issues, which is not an economic efficiency or issue, it's an ethical issue that some of you are going to have to confront in your careers. Because potentially you're going to be asked to compromise your values and principles at some stage. Because as an architect, you might be asked to design something which is below standard. And obviously that's occurred in Australia in the last year because there is, in the last decade, because there is emergent evidence of that. Or you're going to lobby local governments for outcomes which you know are not going to be necessarily good for the residents of the property, but are good for your bottom line. By that I mean producing dwellings which are almost uninhabitable, which I would say some of the construction in Melbourne over the last decade and a half have been. Dwelling units that virtually have no natural light, rooms that are almost too small to be habitable. But the economic pressures of the high cost of the housing system in Australia forces compromises on the industry to do these sorts of things. And some of you will be complicit in that, and that will force you to challenge your values and ethical principles. And perhaps I'll just leave it with that and say for a whole range of reasons, not only for Australia, but I think internationally, virtually doesn't matter what country we're talking about, that the next decade is going to be particularly problematic for housing provision. There's a range of economic forces out there that are operating in a way which we do not know what the long-term implications will be and how that's going to impact on the housing market. So part of the role of people like yourselves, I don't have to worry, I'll be out in the system, is who's going to be able to read this new environment and react to it and create the opportunities. But for example, in Australia, I think for the first time in the last few years, the last 20 years, we're going to see our population growth decline. Well, there's going to be implications of that in the industry. But will that be compensated for by what I said before, by almost zero interest rates? But will that encourage productive investment in the housing system, or will it just increase demand and create excessive house price inflation and accentuate the affordability problems? We don't know. And this is the challenges of the industry that you're going to be probably working in the next decade. So thank you for that. I'll hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Terry. And here's a.
You're going to give me a bottle of water.
No, and I'm not allowed to give you a bottle of wine apparently. But this is a small gift, a small token,
thank you.
a little kind of maybe evening kind of nibble
Yes, I'll have
with a glass of wine.
Thank you very much.
You know that you can supply yourself. But thank you
Good,
very
Mike.
much. And,
Well, I don't need to stay around, do I?
no, you don't. But
unless any of you have a specific
any burning questions for Terry while we have him in the room. Me too. I just might repeat that just to the microphone. Just your question was about the regulations in the housing market and the impact on the quality of buildings.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
Yes, I didn't mention that one in terms of the challenges facing the sector in the next decade, but I think to a large extent the industry has now blotted its copybook, and there's now not a lot of trust in the development and construction industry, particularly the multi-unit industry in Australia. So there is going to be quite substantial political pressures on government to regulate the industry in a way that they haven't for the last 20 years. But at this stage, we don't know how that will manifest. But I did read last week in the New South Wales context that a recent survey of people in New South Wales, 97% of them wanted to get rid of the private certification system that underpins the development industry at the moment. They've lost complete faith in the private certification process to ensure quality dwellings. Whether that actually pushes the certification of properties back to local governments and whether local governments want that role is a difficult one. But it illustrates the challenges for the sector. They've got to rebuild trust in Australia in the next decade. That won't be an easy task because I think we're just seeing the beginning of problems in the sector, not the end. There's going to be more and more properties that are found to be structurally problematic. And for those of you in the industry, that's not a good sign because you've got to then develop products that can reassure clients that quality is there. And the problem is it's always going to be the rogue developers, the rogue builders that are going to undermine it for the rest of you. How you rein in the rogue developers and builders, that's the real challenge for the regulatory industry. I think that's a good question. Yeah. Oh.
You mentioned that there's low interest rate, but is there any relation? Because you will expect that in a context of low interest rate, that an investment like housing is going to be more attractive. So
yes.
You mentioned 30 to 40% now are investors.
Yes.
Why not happen in the demand side and not in the supply? You will expect something like that as well. If investment in the financial investment is not attractive,
well, yes, it's equally attractive for investors to get finance when it's cheap. But investors face all those other impediments that they talked about earlier on. The institutional environment which makes it, even if they get cheap finance, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can construct quickly and get a quality product on the ground. So, or meet market needs. So the potential's there, but they've got to be able to deal with the to deregulate. You've got to deregulate the planning system and make it easier for us to put more properties on the ground. But we've been deregulating for the last 20 years, and the outcomes have been getting worse, not better. Affordability has got worse, quality has got worse. So is deregulation the answer? I don't think it is. In fact, I think deregulation is part of the cause of the affordability problem. Because if you think about it, sorry to take your space, Mike.
No.
If you think about deregulation, I'm back in the 1960s, 1970s and 80s in terms of where my history is in terms of housing. Back then, particularly in the 60s and 80s and 90s, early 90s, the most dwellings you could put on a block of land in large parts of large parts of Melbourne was 3. And you put those, they call them villa units, that run 3 or 4 villa units down a particular allotment or block. Now, if you can only put 3 or 4 units on a block of land as a developer, what are you going to pay for that block of land? Not much, because you've got to recover that cost. But if you can put 50 units or 40 units on it, you'll say, oh, well, I can pay $3 million where it would have only been paying $400,000 or so equivalently back then. So what deregulation has done has ratcheted up land values enormously. And that's had spillover effects to the rest of the housing market by virtue of all land values going up proportionally to what have been driven up in the inner city. So I think deregulation has been partly a major cause of the affordability problem. I think we could have handled we did need deregulation. In fact, this was an aside, Lysander and part of it, and a company called Track Consultants, we won the Planning Institute Award for the best planning study of 1988, which was a study into the deregulation of the planning system in Victoria. But we recommended deregulation with lots of caveats and qualifications. But when government went to do it, all the caveats and qualifications were dropped out. So we didn't get the positives of deregulation, but we got a lot of the negatives, I think. So that's a long-winded way of answering the question.
Do we have time?
Yeah, I value that Terry's here, so please ask questions. We can pick up.
Affordability versus ownership. What's your position on like rental and build to rent and creating that as a more?
Well, we have an affordability problem in rental as well.
Yeah.
In fact, the biggest affordability problem is in the private rental sector. But the other major problem for the private rental sector, particularly in a context that I mentioned before, something like 50% of people in Australia will be in the private rental sector at least up to the age of 60 and probably beyond. What's it like living in the private rental sector? Given the insecurity of that sector, you're going to be living for 30, 40 years in private rental. People are going to be living for 30, 40 years in private rental sector in the context of insecurity, knowing that they could be potentially evicted next year because the landlord wants to control the property for whatever reason. We don't have adequate security of tenure in the private rental sector. So the argument that is being put forward these days is that we need new models of rental provision. One of them is build to rent, which more or less takes us back to where we were in the 1960s. Now, none of you would probably appreciate that, because probably none of you were alive back then. But if you look at the six-packs that are what we call the six-packs, the old three-bedroom dwellings that were built around the inner suburbs in the 1960s, not three-bed, but two-storey cream brick ones down the block. Most of those initially were owned by one company or one individual, because you couldn't buy an individual property in them. You had to buy the whole property and become effectively a professional landlord that managed an entire block of apartments. Strata tightening legislation was brought in the 1970s. Strata tightening legislation being the legislation where each property in an apartment has a separate title to it and can be sold. Strata tightening is a unique, well, not unique anymore, started out in Australia and it's now spread to other countries. But even in other countries, a large percentage of the rental stock is still owned by large companies or one individual. So they're professionally managed on a long-term basis and they can offer long-term security. Our rental stock is owned by lots of what they call mum and pop investors. People that own one property here, perhaps maybe two, but many of them have an income that's not much higher than the tenants, so they're actually not necessarily very professional landlords. So the whole private rental sector in Australia is problematic. And so that's one of the other big changes that will have to occur in the next decade, is a rethinking of the role of the private rental sector, because it's not working. It was always conceived as short-term accommodation for young people making a transition to home ownership. And the residential tenancy legislation reflected that. The management of it reflected that. But that's got to change because we're going to have to move towards it. I think a more European model where you build specifically for rental, long-term income, and you also have residential tenancy legislation where you have long-term leases, 5 years, 10 years, or in much of Northern Europe, Germany, France, or Scandinavia. Once you go into rental property, that's it. You've got it for life. You cannot be evicted, except for non-payment of rent and property damage. But people still buy the rental properties, they just buy with the tenant intact. Here we believe that we've got the right to evict the tenant for sale, which creates enormous insecurity. So yes, I think that's your question has raised a very important issue about the need to restructure the rental sector to have very different products.
And I might think about, I don't think I have it kind of quite in there as a particular kind of focus point. It's a everybody's talking about build to rent, so it might be something now that's come up, and there's a lot out of that, and to think about both in terms of the production, but also in terms of management of it. Because of all those kind of issues, I think it's a good one to kind of tease through the complexity as well of kind of who owns it.
The build-to-rent model is quite problematic in some respects because there's no guarantee that it will be affordable rent. The model is one again to make profits out of, not only in the profits at the construction process, but out of the continuing rental stream. That is potentially sorry.
One last question.
Because we still don't have the inclusionary zoning, but I understand there's this issue of NIMBYism.
NIMBYism is.
With that, have we been able to quantify how much it affects the supply of public housing?
No. The answer is. The question is, has NIMBYism, the resident opposition to multi-unit housing, actually affected? Can we measure the degree to which it's actually inhibited supply? And the answer is no, we actually do not know, except anecdotally. I know of lots of developments that have, or some that have fallen over because of resident opposition. But what proportion of actually have fallen over, I don't know. More commonly, what it does is raise the cost structures by delaying the time of construction, and therefore raises the cost to the developer. It's then had to be passed on some way or other. Right, Mike, sorry about
That's all right.
all the best with your
Another round of applause for Terry. We're really appreciating Terry today. Thank you. And
Can I go out the disabled person's exit? Or
no, you can go out that way.
I'll limp out.
You can go out through the door. Thanks, Terry. We'll see you soon. I kind of half knew this might happen because Terry asked me, we've been talking about this for months, him coming in, and he asked me just before we started today, he said, how long do you want to talk for? Because I can talk for hours. And I said, about an hour. But I hope you found that. I mean, really, what he manages. I mean, he's sowed a lot of seeds, I'm sure, in your mind. He's gone through a lot of very important kind of points that kind of require. You might need this to get home.
I would. I need this. Get into my home. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. And I've been thinking, and hopefully some of those kind of seeds he's kind of sown in terms of things like land value and the relationship between planning scheme and land value, the relationship between landowners and developers, and all of those kind of important things. The speculative system, the finance system, the impact of that in terms of the need to have contracts in place before kind of development can happen. Those kind of things are things that I will be kind of getting into a little bit more detail, because they are actually really, they're key kind of understandings in terms of the particulars in the Australian kind of market. So we are, as much as possible, when we can say we can kind of, there's broad learnings that can apply to other kind of housing markets around the world, kind of that we'll cover in this course, where this is an opportunity to kind of look at the particular here as a way to kind of, I guess, grapple with complexity in kind of housing systems themselves. There's no point in me starting my little thing I was going to do today. I'll pick it up next week. It was, but what I wanted to say, and I'll be checking in with the tutors for your tutes tomorrow, and I actually think the little article about the Queensland tiler who has 4 properties by the time he's 20 kind of story. I might actually maybe ask the tutors, give them an opportunity to kind of work on that little newscom story, because it's so rich in kind of, I think, looking at the narratives around housing, and as well as going to just touch on is the narratives that exist within the kind of different types of research around housing. How much of these things are based in a kind of positivist frame, a kind of a data, and then what you'll see from the Christie reading this week, a very important thing about understanding, when you have concepts of kind of like, fear, terror, and then kind of joy, and all those things kind of operating in different parts of being involved in the housing process. So, I might see if ask the tutors to kind of delve into that a bit this week. I've been looking at because there's been some feedback, and people are kind of looking at the first assignment and kind of going, is it this, is it that, whatever. I've been working with the fantastic people in the library across the way, and there's going to be a little kind of package of materials kind of that we'll kind of distribute kind of next week through the tutorial, and maybe I might talk to it a little bit as well, just to kind of really kind of support kind of in the, if you started doing it, that's fine, but I think week 4, it's due the end of week 6, it'd probably be timely just to look at probably 2 areas. One is look at what is essentially, because what I've asked you to do is as an assignment is an autoethnographic essay, and I've kind of looked at that detail and got, actually autoethnographic essays are actually a little bit niche for a lot of, in terms of that, and we're going to make sure we support you in actually doing kind of working through that in terms of it being a kind of a good piece of work and a good academic essay. And related to that as well, a little bit of support in terms of actually finding good references and research, especially in the kind of the space of the, I guess more in the, a lot of it's kind of like you find some of the best stuff in things like kind of social geography and places like that, but you may not be familiar with those spaces. So we're going to look to get some resources for you in to kind of support that in terms of the first assignment. So you know, they can be, you know, you're all aiming for H1s, of course. So we'll look at that in more detail next week, and we'll get kind of stuck into a bit more of a global frame in terms of kind of housing financialization and some of those kind of big kind of drivers and big concepts around what Terry again kind of touched on and sowed seeds about as well, about this kind of this, you know, cheap money phenomenon and money needing to kind of be kind of used, and gets used for housing, and what's the impact of that when it's disconnected from actual need on the ground and all those impacts. So we'll kind of go into that in a bit of detail kind of next week and look at some very kind of strong emerging voices in response to that in terms around the world as well. People like Rachel Rolnick and Stieglitz with the economics, and a few different people kind of and their opinions. So I'll leave it for there. I won't kind of run late and kind of go through my bit. I'll pick it up next week and pick it up in the tubes. But thanks for coming and thanks for listening at home. And get to your tubes tomorrow and ask tutors lots of questions, participate, get the most out of it. Thank you. Oh, that's all right. That's all right. It's all good. It's all right. Yeah. The tubes going well. Oh, you did it last week. Yeah.
Just as the approaching housing journey in China, so can I just brief on China's housing journey?
I mean, absolutely. Where it's set doesn't matter. I think it's just about.
Housing journey, the housing factors
Yeah, right. It's making those connections. So it's like, and there's a way to kind of do it. And as I say, I'll try to provide some specific guidance for everybody kind of next week to help with that. It might be that, in a way, you can tell the story and then discuss the story as it relates to kind of theory and ideas about housing. So there's a way to kind of do that. So you can talk about. So there's a way to do it. You can talk about the story in China, but you can still then do a discussion about it based on kind of writings and theory that might be based from Australia or other places. So I wanted to kind of give everybody kind of some support. But absolutely, if that's your narrative, if that's your story, then I'm not going to ask you, I don't know how long you've been in Australia studying, I'm not going to ask you to talk about 6 months in your life when it's a really, you know, when you've got a lot more of a history to tell.
Yeah.
You know, that's absolutely true.
That question, do we need to cover all the points in the summary brief, like how the desired life affects the final decision and the cultural reasons?
I think what you do is you're trying to pick out what are the kind of the main reasons, the main drivers, but I think a good essay will show different types of reasons. So there might be a type of reason that's about family, you know, the actual makeup of the family. There might be a reason that's about economic conditions, but it's, you know, so they're kind of pointers to kind of ask for a kind of a broad kind of perspective on telling the story.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
That's all right.
And
Please.
so one question. So how can we balance the narrative and academic? So do you have some examples?
Yeah, part of that is I think it's referring to, and that's why I realised I think to give everybody support for that next week is to kind of look to, so I'll have actual guidance, but if you're kind of working on it,
But I want to start now.
No, you can start without having additional support. I think, okay, so let me try to give you examples. So let's say your kind of provide, part of the narrative you're kind of telling is about, I'll just give an example, moving from, a family moving from the country to the city,
So
right? And that's part of the narrative. You could find an example of kind of, research of kind of locations, you could find an example from research from the US, from Australia, of different kind of impacts of new physical environments and kind of the impact of that on families, as a reference. So,
So can I mention words I,
yes.
I,
Yeah,
In the past, because
you don't have to. You don't have to.
Okay.
Because some people feel more comfortable talking about making it third person.
A third person.
But it's still, but there is that. I am asking you though to put kind of a story that kind of into it. But you can kind of you can make yourself you can make yourself the object, in so to speak, as well, and it is a kind of it's a style choice, and there's kind of as I say, what I've kind of realised, and I've just been working with the library, will provide some examples where you can see different ways that can be done. So I'm just working with them this week to put that together. But I do realise it's week 3 and you might be kind of starting. I know a lot of people don't start till later though, but I appreciate that you're starting now.
Thanks. Sorry, just one quick question.
Sure.
Sorry for making home late.
Yeah, it's okay.
Because I'm really concerned about I'm getting a higher mark in this one.
Yeah.
So I just wondering what type of essay about each one you're looking for. For example, because I've done many academic essay before, but I never written an essay with a subjective. So I just wondering how these things can be done, be both narrative and analytical and critical. So what I'm thinking now is that something like, for example, if I describe the housing choice of my grandparents, firstly I'll say, for example, the housing policy in China have played a major role in shaping individuals' housing choice, and then I describe my situation, and maybe link to some literature, says for example, housing policy impacts housing choice, something.
Yeah.
And then further, I discuss further something like why sometimes the theory does not actually fit the situation, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds good. That's good place. You've got a comparative over time, so you've got a kind of a time frame, and you can look at those. I mean, I guess this is about, what are these assignments about? They're about your opportunity to demonstrate understanding of kind of the knowledge that we're kind of imparting. So you can demonstrate that, as you described, you can demonstrate that by looking at having analysis understanding of your grandparents' time and context, and look at that, and then bring it to, okay, my time and context now, and how that's different. So that's one way to do it. And then you can, so there are different ways to do it, but it's about demonstrating that understanding that, it's not as simple as saying, well, there was, the place where my grandparents lived was just the place that was available. You're kind of going, there was a context to the provision of housing, the choices are made, the context of that, and now you're saying, and you're making that.
Comparison between time.
It's one way to go. It's one way to do it. You can do it.